The context of America in the mid-20th century. The mid-20th century in the United States was a tumultuous, transformative, and altogether fascinating period in American history. It was an age marked by profound changes, social, political, economic, and cultural, that would shape not only the destiny of the nation, but also the lives and aspirations of countless individuals who called it home. Economically, the United States was emerging from the hardships of the Great Depression in the 1930s, and after World War II, experienced an unprecedented boom. During the late 1940s through the 1960s, American industry flourished. Suburban neighborhoods sprouted outside every major city, and the American dream became a powerful mythos. New cars filled the highways, televisions flickered in living rooms, and consumerism blossomed as families took pride in home ownership and modern conveniences. Yet this landscape of abundance was also marked by deep inequalities, racial, gender-based, and economic, that sowed discord beneath the surface. Demographically, there was an explosion of population growth, famously known as the baby boom. The returning GIs of World War II started families, and soon, children's laughter echoed in nearly every suburb. Along with this prosperity came rapidly growing cities and the slow decline of rural life. Missouri, at the very center of the country, captured much of this transition. It was a crossroads between the agricultural traditions of the Old South and West, and the modern industrial society that was rapidly emerging from the North and East. On the political stage, the United States was ascending to superpower status in the aftermath of World War II, entering the early throes of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Nuclear anxiety was ever present. School children drilled for the possibility of atomic attack, and families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The federal government flexed its growing muscles, building highways, funding scientific research, and pushing for civil rights reforms, though often hampered by conservative opposition and the weight of tradition. Culturally, the 1950s and 1960s oscillated between popular nostalgia for so-called simpler times and mounting unrest. Rock and roll and television redefined mass entertainment, while an undercurrent of social tension simmered. The civil rights movement, the push for women's liberation, and new waves of immigration challenged the status quo and reshaped the country's identity. For many, especially women and minorities, the era was one of struggle, often invisible, to secure equality and opportunity in a society that promoted conformity. Urban legends, famous crimes, and high-profile court trials captivated the public. As sensational journalism flourished, the archetype of the femme fatale, a seductive and mysterious woman, was popularized in film noir and tabloids, mirroring real-life anxieties and the shifting role of women in society. In this climate, rich with both promise and peril, our story takes root. Missouri itself, with its iconic gateway arch symbolizing American expansion and boundless ambition, stood as both backdrop and mirror to the contradictions of the time. The state's picturesque lakes, forests, and cities became the silent witnesses to human triumph and tragedy, setting the stage for mysteries both large and small to unfold. It was in this charged and often contradictory landscape that the notorious figure at the center of this tale would rise, her story forever entwined with the fabric of mid-century America. The main protagonist, Sarah Kinn, known in sensational headlines as the Rose Killer, or the Goddess of the Gun, is a character as enigmatic as she is captivating. Born on November 30, 1939 in the small, sleepy town of Mitsui, Missouri, Sarah was the kind of child who seemed destined for a life less ordinary. Her looks, even as a toddler, were the subject of admiring whispers: porcelain skin, delicate features, and a serene composure that belied her age. As she grew up, it became clear that her charm was matched by an uncanny intelligence and a fierce sensitivity to the world around her. Sarah's early years were steeped in the slow rhythms of rural Missouri. Raised in a modest family, her parents worked hard to provide her the comfort and education they'd always dreamed of, but Sarah's ambitions soared far above the boundaries of her small town. She became enthralled by glossy magazines, enamored with the glamour and excitement of distant American cities like Chicago and New York. Her nights were spent under the soft glow of her bedside lamp, devouring stories about movie stars, socialites, and the elusive American dream. When she was in her early teens, fate intervened, and her family relocated to Washington, D.C., a move that felt to her like stepping onto the set of a big city film. There, Sarah's innate poise blossomed. She quickly adapted, dazzling classmates with her beauty and wit, making friends with ease and immersing herself in the city's vibrant cultural landscape. Yet, in her heart, she always felt like an outsider looking in, longing to transcend her circumstances and join the world of her idols. Sarah's allure wasn't just surface level, she possessed a keen perception of people's motives, a preternatural ability to read a room, sense tension, and adapt her persona as needed. She was polite and gracious, but there was something mysterious and slightly remote about her, a quality that, more often than not, drew others closer. During her later teens, she captured the attention of James Kinn, a Princeton student visiting family in Missouri. James was smart, outgoing, and came from a respectable background. Their whirlwind romance was the talk of their social circle, culminating in a seemingly idyllic marriage after Sarah's unexpected pregnancy. To outsiders, it looked like the fulfillment of the American dream, the beautiful couple, young and full of promise. Yet, beneath the shiny veneer, cracks began to appear. Sarah's dissatisfaction with small-town life only deepened as she struggled with motherhood and the daily grind of a young wife with limited means. Money was always tight. Although James worked hard, he could never quite satisfy Sarah's craving for excitement and luxury, a lifestyle she believed she deserved. Shopping binges became her escape, salons and department stores her domain. The more she chased happiness in things, the farther it seemed to run. Despite presenting herself as the dutiful wife and mother, Sarah harbored a private resentment and a growing restlessness. She viewed her husband's pragmatic approach to life as lackluster and uninspired, an obstacle to her dreams instead of the partner she'd once adored. Friends and neighbors described her as impeccable and polite to a fault, but deeply private, rarely confiding in others or showing vulnerability. After the sudden and mysterious death of James, Sarah's persona shifted further. No longer constrained by the expectations of her marriage, she cultivated an even more deliberate image of strength and mystery, captivating the interest and suspicions of everyone in Missouri's tight-knit community. The insurance payout she received after James's death allowed her to explore a new degree of independence. Money, once her primary anxiety, now granted her a veneer of control over her fate. Throughout her life, Sarah maintained a paradoxical relationship with the world, simultaneously immersed in it and detached from it, admired yet mistrusted, pitied but also feared. Her interactions with others, whether lovers, friends, or adversaries, were marked by calculation, sometimes warmth, and often an underlying tension born from a past she never fully revealed. Ultimately, Sarah Kinn's story is one of contradiction and complexity. Driven by ambition and haunted by dissatisfaction, she inhabited the role of an all-American beauty with a dangerous edge, a woman at once alluring and elusive, unforgettable to all who crossed her path. Her life invites endless speculation as to how much of her fate was molded by circumstance, and how much by her own enigmatic choices. The American Dream and the Pursuit of Ascent. From an early age, Sarah Kinn was captivated by the shining promise of the American dream, a concept that, for millions across the nation, had become a near-mythical road to self-fulfillment, prosperity, and happiness. For Sarah, growing up in the humble heartland of Missouri, the American dream was more than a national ideal. It was a personal calling, a window out of the ordinary and into a life of glamour, adventure, and respect. Even as a child, she felt out of place among the dusty roads and slow pace of rural life. Her imagination fueled by glossy magazines, Hollywood starlets, and the dazzling stories of those who had made it big in the cities. Sarah's environment, while supportive in many ways, could not quench her yearning for more. Her family worked hard and provided modest comfort, but she saw herself as destined for something extraordinary. The sleekness of urban living, the high society parties she saw in moving pictures, and the sense of possibility that pulsed through America in the post-war era, all became obsessions. The transformative power of the 1950s, a time when upward mobility seemed possible for anyone with ambition, only stoked the fire within her. When her family moved to Washington, D.C., it was as though the doors of opportunity had finally swung open. Surrounded by the trappings of modern urban life, Sarah flourished socially, quickly learning how to adapt and impress in a world that rewarded poise and public charm. She embraced shopping sprees with friends, marveled at nouveau riche acquaintances, and absorbed every lesson she could about class, status, and the careful performance of refinement. Her nights were spent not only dreaming, but planning, envisioning how she too might cross that invisible barrier between ordinary people and the elite. As Sarah navigated her late teens, The social dynamics of the era both helped and hindered her ascent. America's fascination with beauty and femininity became tools in her arsenal. She knew how to dress for effect, how to evade nosy questions with coy charm, and, more importantly, how to turn fleeting encounters into lasting advantages. Sarah's ambitions were not merely for herself. She saw success as proof of her intelligence and willpower, a way to transcend the limitations forced upon so many women of her station. Her whirlwind relationship with James Kinn seemed at first like the final piece of the puzzle. A union that, at least for a fleeting moment, gave her the kind of security and social standing she had long coveted. Yet, even as she enjoyed the privileges of marriage and motherhood, Sarah remained restless. The modest lifestyle James provided could not quench her thirst for luxury or the excitement she associated with the American dream. Her unhappiness grew with every sacrifice and every unmet expectation, clouds gathering behind her carefully painted smiles. To Sarah, every challenge, a lack of money, an unforeseen tragedy, a strained relationship, was not just an obstacle but a dare. She chased solutions with tenacity, working part-time, scheming for small luxuries and pushing family finances to their edge. Yet the dream always remained just out of reach, a glittering prize she could see but never quite touch. In the land of opportunity, Sarah Kinn saw herself not as a passive participant but as a contender, ready to gamble everything for her long-awaited breakthrough. This relentless pursuit, this refusal to yield to limitations, whether imposed by society, marriage, or fate, became both her greatest asset and her fatal flaw. In the complex web of ambition, dissatisfaction, and desire that shaped her journey, the American dream was less a destination than a chase, one that would drive Sarah to decisions both daring and devastating, with consequences that echoed across generations. An unexpected turning point in love. Sarah Kinn's path to adulthood was laced with aspirations and loneliness, but nothing had prepared her for the way love would fundamentally alter her trajectory. Her teenage years, which had been filled with daydreams about city lights and magazine lifestyles, took a drastic turn when she met James Kinn in a modest Missouri church social in the sultry summer of 1956. The meeting wasn't marked by fireworks or melodrama, but something in James's easy confidence, Princeton wit, and genuine smile rattled Sarah's carefully maintained defenses. James, 5 years older and already a university student, was the object of admiration for many in their town, tall, well-mannered, and exuding a sense of assurance that made others gravitate toward him. For Sarah, who had always felt like she was on the outside looking in, their courtship felt like a chance not only for love, but legitimacy. She was whisked away by the whirlwind of first dates, handwritten letters, and late-night conversations, all colored by an undercurrent of secrecy and urgency so common in the stories of the time. Their romance, however, was swift, and by societal standards, unconventional. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant at the age of 17, the pressure of small-town morals and family expectation bore down with full weight. In the late 1950s in Missouri, premarital pregnancy was a stigma that could haunt a woman for life. For Sarah, it was both a crisis and an opening, forcing James to make a hasty but honorable proposal and setting them on a path neither had fully imagined. Their wedding, held in the local church, was attended by family and a scattering of curious neighbors, the ceremony echoing both hope and unspoken anxieties. Afterward, Sarah found herself transported from girlhood dreams to the realities of marriage and impending motherhood before she had even tasted her own freedom. For a brief window, though, the couple tried to carve out a new world together near James's university. These days were filled with patchwork joys, sharing quick meals between James's classes, shopping for baby things, strolling hand in hand in the evenings, and making whispered promises about the future. But happiness proved fragile. Sarah suffered a miscarriage soon after their move, an event that cast a long, cold shadow over their relationship. What might have brought them closer instead amplified their differences. James threw himself deeper into his studies and work, while Sarah's longing for connection, luxury, and acknowledgement grew sharper. The loss marked a subtle but decisive fracture. Feelings that had once crackled with excitement turned brittle with disappointment, their closeness now veiled by routine and unspoken resentment. Sarah's experience of love, a love born out of both yearning and necessity, became a stage for her internal conflicts. She craved genuine partnership and understanding, yet found herself boxed in by obligation and the limitations of her circumstances. As bills stacked, James worked harder, and Sarah's senses dulled against the background noise of the American heartland. the once glittering vision of romance and fulfillment faded into something altogether more complex. She would never again look at love as a source of rescue. From this turning point on, love became both a choice and a burden, a mosaic of longing, regret, and restless hope. The first tragedy and the seeds of suspicion. In the tapestry of Sarah Kinn's life, the first true tragedy arrived quietly, like a bitter wind sweeping through an open window. By the early 1960s, on the surface, her life in suburban Missouri gave little hint of the storm brewing beneath. She had the outward trappings of the American dream, a husband with a promising career, a comfortable home, and young children. Yet in May of 1960, this fragile idyll would shatter with a single deafening shot. It was dusk on an ordinary Tuesday when the incident unfolded. James Kinn, her husband, was found fatally wounded in their bedroom. The official narrative, pieced together from Sarah's own trembling account, was fraught with both heartbreak and perplexity. According to Sarah, she had just finished bathing their 2-year-old daughter Dana, when the toddler wandered into the master bedroom clutching her father's pistol, an all-too-accessible .22 revolver James kept in his nightstand. Sarah said she heard an inquiring voice, then an abrupt, explosive sound. Rushing from the bathroom, she discovered a sight that would haunt her memory. Little Dana, standing beside her father's unmoving body, the pistol still gripped in her tiny hands. Paramedics and local authorities arrived within minutes, but there was little to be done for James. The small community was rocked by the horror of a child's accidental brush with death. Grief pierced every corner of Sarah's life, yet almost immediately, shock was accompanied by an uneasy, persistent doubt that settled over the neighborhood like a mist. The police initiated an investigation, but the forensic tools of the era were crude by modern standards. They found no clear fingerprints on the revolver, ballistics were inconclusive, and gunshot residue tests were unavailable at the time. The only evidence, aside from Sarah's account, was the testimony of neighbors who recalled Dana's fondness for toy guns and play acting as an adult. It could happen, some admitted anxiously, but how likely is it? Whispers rippled through the community as new details emerged. Friends and relatives noted that Sarah, always drawn to the finer things in life, had grown restless and increasingly resentful. With James struggling to balance family and work, their arguments about money, household responsibilities, and outgrown ambitions became harder to conceal. Some observed Sarah's frustration at James's inability to provide the comforts she envied from her socialite friends. The American dream that Sarah so desperately pursued seemed to crumble at the edges. Most damning, perhaps, was what happened after James's death. Within weeks, Sarah claimed the life insurance payout, an amount substantial enough to arouse discomfort even among her closest confidants. She promptly purchased a new car and appeared in public looking composed, even radiant, rather than shattered or withdrawn. To those who looked closely, it was as if a veil had lifted from her eyes, a transformation so stark it left more than a few neighbors exchanging wary looks. James's family, wary but not without compassion, quietly shared their unease with detectives. Arguments about finances and fidelity, previously whispered in the shadows, now became matters of official record. More than one person recalled hearing Sarah disparage her husband's ambitions or threaten to take care of things if he didn't provide more. The local police were confronted with a classic small-town conundrum. Was this a tragic accident or something far more sinister? Unable to disprove Sarah's account, lacking concrete physical evidence and facing pressure to restore calm, authorities closed the case as an accidental shooting. Officially, Sarah was a grieving widow. Unofficially, the specter of suspicion would follow her, woven into every future interaction. Subtle glances at the grocery store, measured pauses in polite conversation, anonymous notes left on her doorstep. Looking back, this first tragedy was more than just the end of a life. It was the sowing of a deep mistrust. Whether Sarah was a woman beset by circumstance or something more dangerous, the truth became as elusive as smoke blowing across the Missouri plains. The answers, it seemed, would have to wait until the next sorrowful act in an increasingly disturbing story. The second murder and the network of lovers. The second turning point in Sarah Kinn's astonishing saga unfolded not long after the dust had barely settled around the tragic demise of her husband James. Few in Mitsui, Missouri, would have predicted that scandal would once again return to haunt their small town, this time with even greater ferocity and intrigue. The whispers had persisted since James's death, painting Sarah as both a victim and an enigmatic figure, but it was her involvement in the next calamitous crime that transformed her from a grieving widow into the center of a mysterious, tangled network, where love, envy, and betrayal collided in deadly ways. In the early months of 1961, as the shock of James's passing receded into the background noise of local gossip, Sarah appeared to embrace her newfound independence. No longer tethered to the suffocating expectations of marriage, she began to cultivate a more vibrant social life. Old friends and new acquaintances alike described her as captivating, even magnetic. Some were drawn to her allure, while others kept their distance, unsettled by the shadowy rumors still swirling around her. Her wardrobe became more daring, her laughter a touch more pronounced, but beneath her surface-level confidence, an undertow of unresolved pain and ambition still lingered. It wasn't long before Sarah's charm brought her into contact with Walter Scott, a young successful car salesman at a popular dealership just off Route 66. Walter, known for his good looks and easygoing manner, was married to the intelligent, highly perceptive Joanne Scott. The Scotts were considered by many to be the epitome of the suburban dream: a lovely house, 2 children, a circle of friends, and a reputation for decency. But like so much of post-war American life, appearances were deceiving. Sarah and Walter's paths crossed at a charity auction organized by the local women's club. Their first encounter was innocuous: small talk about the latest television programs, a mutual joke about the blandness of the finger sandwiches. Yet something electric and forbidden flickered between them. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself seeking out events where she might accidentally bump into Walter again. The two shared a growing sense of restlessness, their late-night telephone conversations meandering from flirtation to confessions of discontent. The chemistry between Sarah and Walter quickly became an open secret. Neighbors whispered about Sarah's frequent visits to the Scott residence under the pretense of delivering borrowed recipe books or returning children's toys. Joanne, never one to miss subtle cues, sensed the tension. Her trust in her husband began to erode, and her friendship with Sarah cooled to brittle civility. The community's patience wore thin, as many struggled to decide whether Sarah was merely unlucky in love or calculating in pursuit. Things escalated in the spring of 1962 when Joanne was found dead in her home. The official version suggested a burglary gone wrong, a struggle, shattered glass, a fatal gunshot, yet almost immediately inconsistencies arose. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables were taken, and the house was otherwise untouched. Most damning, Sarah Kinn had been the last known visitor on the evening before Joanne's death. She told police that she'd simply stopped by to return a baking dish, but her account was vague, her mood described as unnervingly composed given the horrific news. The murder sent shockwaves through the town and ignited a media firestorm that quickly spilled beyond Missouri's borders. Regional tabloids dubbed the case the Mitsui widow mystery, splashing photographs of a stoic Sarah Kinn across their front pages and fueling speculation about her involvement. Law enforcement, now under intense public scrutiny, reopened the investigation into James Kinn's death while simultaneously gathering evidence in the Scott case. Walter, visibly shaken by the double tragedies shadowing his life, became both a suspect and a figure of pity. Early interrogations revealed his growing disillusionment with Joanne and his clandestine affair with Sarah. Police unearthed stacks of love notes, passionate, desperate, and at times tinged with guilt, exchanged between him and Sarah. Walter repeatedly insisted on his innocence, claiming he was away on a business trip at the time of Joanne's murder, but his alibi wavered under cross-examination. Suspicion rapidly shifted to Sarah, whose motives were dissected at every local bar, beauty shop, and kitchen table. As the evidence mounted, so too did the complexity of the case. Sarah's relationships became the focal point of investigation. Detectives questioned every friend, relative, and acquaintance she had. Some painted her as a misunderstood, ambitious woman caught in a web of male desire and societal judgment. Others saw her as an opportunist, adept at manipulating affections for personal gain. Old classmates recalled stories of Sarah's ability to charm and outmaneuver, while former employers described her professionalism intermingled with occasional flashes of cold calculation. One detail could not be ignored. Sarah had recently purchased a new car using the remainder of her late husband's insurance payout. Some observers noted the timing of this purchase, just days after Joanne's funeral, struck them as oddly insensitive if not incriminating. Sarah, meanwhile, maintained an unwavering calm that seemed to alternate between bravery in the face of adversity and a haunting detachment. The prosecution would later describe her as an unreliable narrator of her own life. The investigation into Joanne's death struggled for traction. Despite 3 separate interviews, police found no physical evidence directly tying Sarah to the murder. Forensic science of the early 1960s was rudimentary, and the crime scene had been unintentionally compromised by neighbors and relatives flocking to offer support in the hours after Joanne was discovered. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, was never found, and the local press pored over every scrap of rumor, further muddying public opinion. Legal maneuvering quickly took center stage. Prosecutors pushed for an indictment, hinging much of their case on circumstantial factors: Sarah's presence at the scene, her relationship with Walter, her financial motivations, and her evasive answers under questioning. The defense, led by a sharp-tongued attorney from St. Louis, countered that Sarah was a scapegoat for a scandal-hungry public whose only crime was to inspire desire and resentment in equal measure. Sarah herself became a master of public image, wearing carefully selected outfits to every court appearance and maintaining steady eye contact with the jury. Journalists, captivated by her beauty and poise, published conflicting accounts, some treating her as a tragic figure beset by misogyny, others as a Machiavellian schemer cloaked in innocence. Local women's groups debated whether to offer their support or denounce her as a cautionary tale. As the trial progressed, the prosecution unveiled intercepted letters and witness testimony describing furtive meetings, whispered threats, and secret plans. The defense questioned the integrity of these witnesses, suggesting that jealousy, small-town biases, and unspoken fears about an assertive woman fueled their statements more than any direct observation. Meanwhile, Walter Scott remained on the periphery, a broken man avoiding the public eye, left to cope with the ruins of his family and reputation. In the end, the jury was presented with a thicket of circumstantial evidence but nothing conclusive. While some jurors were convinced of Sarah's guilt, others expressed lingering doubts, citing reasonable holes in the prosecution's timeline and the conspicuous absence of physical proof. After days of heated deliberation, Sarah was acquitted of all charges in Joanne's murder. The verdict upended both her supporters and detractors, deepening the public's fascination with her unpredictable trajectory. Yet even after the legal proceedings concluded, the case left scars on everyone involved. For Sarah, the trial marked a profound turning point, the moment she truly realized her power to command attention, to both mesmerize and infuriate. For her remaining allies, the result proved the danger of quick judgment and the limitations of the justice system. For many, especially those within the Scots circle or who remembered James Kinn's demise, suspicion clung to Sarah like a second skin. The notion that she could seduce, outmaneuver, and survive so many scandals became an inseparable part of her legacy. The ripple effect extended beyond Missouri. Magazine writers and television anchors speculated for months on the bizarre, tragic pattern trailing Sarah's footsteps. Her relationship with Walter, never rekindled after Joanne's death, became emblematic of her allure and the devastating consequences that seemed to follow it. Whispers about other lovers, distant cities, and unexplained misfortunes further cemented Sarah's reputation as a true femme fatale, a woman as much myth as reality, forever walking the razor's edge between temptation and destruction. In private retrospection, Sarah would later describe this period as both a liberation and a curse. While she relished her independence and notoriety, the fleeting sense of being seen at last, she also felt the chill of isolation and the weight of unspoken accusations. The events surrounding the second murder left her inextricably marked, both feared and admired, as she continued on her winding path through the shadows of American history. The fateful trial, Sarah Kinn's day in court. For months following Joanne Scott's murder, the town of Mitsui, Missouri simmered with a combination of dread, excitement, and uncertainty. Local diners buzzed with the latest rumors. Tabloids from St. Louis to Chicago scrambled for scraps of scandal, and whispers about Sarah Kinn, the Rose Killer, seeped through every layer of American society. Yet nothing encapsulated the turning point of her infamous journey quite like the trial that would ultimately determine her fate. The courthouse itself was an old red-bricked building perched modestly in the town center, a structure that seemed both protective and suffocating, depending on one's place in the drama. Inside its chambers, sunlight spilled through stained glass, streaking onto battered wooden benches lined by townspeople straining to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become both sphinx and scapegoat. Sarah, flanked by her defense team, made her entrance daily with composed poise, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, her expressions unreadable. Spectators and press alike jostled for position, aiming to parse any flicker of emotion, a single downcast gaze or fleeting smile, while Sarah appeared to float above it all, self-possessed yet untouchably distant. Jury selection alone foreshadowed the coming spectacle. Prospective jurors were grilled about impartiality. Had they read the papers, overheard gossip, or perhaps attended church functions with either the Kin or Scott families? Even before the opening statements, it was clear there would be no such thing as true objectivity. The prosecution, helmed by District Attorney Samuel Garrison, built its case with a dogged if somewhat theatrical touch. Garrison paced and thundered as he set the scene of Joanne Scott's death. A quiet house, a promising life cut short, and the haunting question of motive. He unearthed the web of relationships binding Sarah to the Scott family and painted her as a cunning seductress, a woman with a taste for luxury, a knack for manipulating men, and a pattern of proximity to tragedy. Every love note exchanged with Walter Scott, every late-night visit, was dissected for confession or conspiracy. Did Sarah envy Joanne's lifestyle? Did she resent being treated as an outsider, a second-class citizen in a town she had never truly called home? Circumstantial evidence formed the backbone of the government's charges. There was no murder weapon found. Sarah's fingerprints, so eagerly sought by the press, never materialized on crucial pieces of evidence. Instead, the prosecution relied on the timing of Sarah's last visit to the Scott home, her financial exertions in the wake of previous tragedy, and her chilly composure in interviews. Garrison's crescendo came as he read aloud one of the more dramatic love letters, his voice rising with the words, "I would do anything for us to be free." The defense, in contrast, was surgical and unflappable. They cast Sarah as a target of small-town suspicion, a cosmopolitan woman too ambitious by local standards and therefore an easy scapegoat. What of Joanne's own enemies, they pressed, or the botched burglary angle dismissed too soon? They questioned the competence of early police work, especially with the crowded crime scene and the absence of modern forensics. Crucially, they deconstructed the prosecution's timeline, highlighting each uncertainty. Where exactly was Walter Scott when Joanne died, and why was Sarah, who had so much to lose, acting so unconcerned if she were actually guilty? Sarah's defense team didn't shy from highlighting her allure and public persona. She has been judged before she ever set foot in this courtroom, her lead counsel Miriam Reeve argued. Do not let beauty, or the myth of beauty, convince you of guilt. Jurors were repeatedly reminded of American traditions, innocent until proven guilty, aversion to trial by media, as Reeve exposed holes in the prosecution's circumstantial net. Witnesses called by the state frequently faltered under the defense's withering cross-examination, some admitting to not remembering clearly or having only heard rumors, not facts. One neighbor admitted to seeing Sarah leave the Scott residence the night before, but not at the actual time of the crime. Others recounted long-standing jealousy or personal grievances rather than direct knowledge. The trial took on a life of its own. Reporters filed dispatches every evening, some sympathetic, some scathingly critical. Sarah's carefully chosen wardrobe became a topic of speculation. Did her sleek black suit signal mourning or hidden arrogance? Did the pearl earrings she wore on day 3 mean anything, or were they a shield against the mounting judgment? Beyond public spectacle, the courtroom itself was a tinderbox. For every suggestion that Sarah was a manipulator, there was a counter-argument about misogyny and the dangers of demonizing a woman who defied small-town expectations. Outside, protesters and supporters camped on courthouse steps, their signs blending pleas for justice with impassioned defenses of a woman they had never known. The witnesses called by both sides revealed as much about the town's collective psyche as they did about the crime. Joanne Scott's sister wept as she confronted Sarah on the stand, her tears fueling headlines the next morning. Walter Scott, gaunt and visibly worn, recounted his affair with Sarah through halting testimony, each answer loaded with subtext and regret. He insisted again and again that he loved Joanne, but reporters noted his gaze flickering toward Sarah when he said it. Critically, the prosecution's smoking gun evidence failed to materialize. The missing .38 revolver, the presumed murder weapon, was never recovered. Forensics of the time could not confirm powder burns conclusively, or even prove who would have been strong enough to fire the shot. Diaries and correspondence offered tantalizing hints, but no outright confession. As the weeks passed, the jury saw arguments and egos collide. Sarah herself was called to the stand, answering questions with unwavering calm. She recounted her whereabouts in crisp detail, refusing to falter under cross-examination. "I have nothing to hide," she declared at one point. Some jurors marked her poise as confidence, others as the hallmark of a practiced liar. Outside the courthouse, the press speculated endlessly about why Sarah's story fascinated so many. Was it her beauty, her air of mystery, or the creeping suspicion that she reflected the darker parts of the American dream, a desire to rise above, no matter the cost? By the time closing arguments arrived, the pressure inside the courthouse was nearly unbearable. Prosecutor Garrison thundered, "You have seen the pattern of death that follows, Miss Kinn. Is this a coincidence or design?" Defense attorney Reeve countered, "Do not let fear or envy sway you from justice. There is no proof here, only rumor and conjecture. Resist the temptation to make Sarah Kinn the villain of a story none of us fully understand." The jury deliberated for days, their sequestered nights filled with heated debate. Townspeople gathered on courthouse steps waiting for any sign of a verdict. Some sent prayers, others cursed Sarah's name. The tension was palpable, as if the fate of the entire community hinged on the outcome. When the verdict was finally read, "Not guilty," a hush swept over the room, briefly replaced by a stifled gasp and the sound of shuffling papers. Reporters sprinted to phones, cameras flashed. Sarah showed little emotion, maintaining the same faint, inscrutable smile she'd worn throughout. The judge banged his gavel to restore order, warning the crowd against outbursts. For Sarah, the acquittal changed everything and nothing at all. She was technically free, but her reputation was in ruins. Some local women saw her victory as evidence of a legal system stacked against them, while others whispered about how charm and beauty could bend justice. Men in bars argued over whether she'd gotten away with murder, or was merely the tragic scapegoat of small-town envy and moral hysteria. In many ways, the trial marked the true fork in Sarah's life. Media attention would follow her for years, amplifying every rumor and shadow. She viewed her newfound notoriety with both pride and exhaustion, learning to wield her image as both a shield and a weapon. She struggled with the isolation and suspicion that followed, particularly as other events began to cast suspicion on her yet again. Ultimately, the trial was more than a battle over a single crime. It became a referendum on class, morality, gender, and the American dream itself. Sarah Kinn's day in court highlighted the power of performance, the ambiguity of truth, and the enduring human urge to make sense of tragedy, whether by searching for villains or by choosing to believe in innocence, even when it seems impossibly out of reach. The enigmatic mysteries surrounding James Kinn's death. As the years passed, the mysteries surrounding James Kinn's tragic demise only seemed to deepen rather than fade, becoming an enduring shadow that loomed over Sarah's life and the collective consciousness of Mitsui, Missouri. From the day of his untimely death, whispers and half-spoken suspicions coiled through neighborhoods, transcending the mere facts of the case and fusing into a mythology of uncertainty. Looking back through a 1960s lens retrofitted with present-day skepticism, the fatal shooting in the Kinn residence was, to many, no longer just a misfortune. It had all the hallmarks of a carefully staged tragedy, a riddle that refused to be solved. The official narrative, as established at the time, painted a story tinged with innocence and horror, a toddler's tragic mistake, a wife's desperate response. Sarah's voice on that fateful night, ringing through the local switchboard operator, was described by some as hysterical with shock, while others remarked on a strange, almost clinical composure. Accounts of the scene offered contradictions. The revolver, carelessly left in a nightstand, the lack of clear fingerprints, the inconclusive ballistics. Even at the funeral, townsfolk exchanged sidelong glances, uncertain where sympathy ended and suspicion began. As the insurance payout was processed with remarkable speed, rumors took root that Sarah had contacted the insurance company before the funeral, an act that, whether innocent or not, cast a long, cold shadow of motive. Some claimed to overhear a tense phone conversation between Sarah and a mysterious man just days earlier. Others swore they had seen a stranger's car parked outside the Kinn house in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, its license plate coated in the ochre dust of distant highways. None of these anecdotes, of course, amounted to evidence, but they multiplied, their very repetition lending them a ghostly authority in community memory. James's mother, privately tormented by doubt and loss, kept diaries in which she agonized over her daughter-in-law's demeanor. She wrote that Sarah's grief seemed practiced, almost as if it had been rehearsed in front of the mirror. Former friends went over their last encounters, recalling offhand remarks Sarah had made about wanting a new start, or admitting that she felt boxed in by her marriage. It was a brittle time for everyone. Social circles fractured, and old confidences became new sources of anxiety. Some neighbors, loyal to Sarah, dismissed all this as the paranoia of a town bored with its own peace. Others grew quietly obsessed, following her movements and sharing their observations with local lawmen. Law enforcement's investigation, never robust by modern standards, did little to quell the rumor mill. The absence of gunshot residue testing, the hurried cataloging of physical evidence, and the artless questioning of a frightened 2-year-old, these procedural gaps left ample room for alternative narratives to take root. Over time, a handful of detectives privately wondered if they had missed something vital. Was it really plausible that a toddler could aim and pull the trigger with such devastating precision? Was the gun placed just so, or had it been moved later to support a better story? Years later, retired detective Paul Frawley would admit, "We were under a lot of pressure to close the case quick. Everybody wanted it to be over, especially Sarah, maybe too eager." With no legal closure, no conviction, no confession, not even a clear-cut theory of what transpired, family and friends fell into camps of belief and disbelief. The local newspaper, ever attuned to drama, published annual retrospectives on the case, each time resurfacing hints of malfeasance and unanswered questions. Private investigators, some legitimate, others more akin to hunters of urban legends, sought alternate explanations. One theory that gained traction, years after the initial tragedy, suggested that Sarah had hired a drifter passing through town to stage the incident. Others insisted the family had been the target of a botched robbery, or that James himself had been contemplating suicide as business setbacks mounted and his relationship reached an impasse. These hypotheses multiplied with each re-examination of the evidence file. Tiny details, previously deemed irrelevant, were reconsidered. Why did the porch light burn out the night before the shooting? Who was the unfamiliar woman seen leaving the pharmacy in a hurry on the day of James's death? Could she have been an accomplice, or merely an innocent stranger? Why were Sarah's alibis for the hour before the incident so vague, yet oddly consistent whenever law enforcement checked in? Adding further layers of doubt, new testimonies decades later from James's surviving siblings included claims of threats and late-night arguments between the couple, overheard and hastily dismissed at the time. Ex-colleagues of James hinted that he had recently discovered irregularities in his finances. Had someone pushed him to the edge, either emotionally or physically? Sarah's every move following the death was subject to microscopic scrutiny. The purchase of a new car, her resolute return to public life, the apparent absence of the crushing sorrow expected of a young widow, each element fueled gossip that Sarah was playing her own carefully constructed role. Psychologists interviewed for magazine exposés suggested that Sarah displayed classic narcissistic characteristics, incapable of true guilt or sadness, while others argued that she was simply a survivor, hardened by necessity in a brutally patriarchal society. The reinvestigation of the case in the wake of Joanne Scott's murder further complicated matters. Detectives reopened old files and re-interviewed witnesses whose memories had grown only more vivid, if not more reliable, with time. They found no new DNA or forensic breakthroughs, but the pressure from two parallel tragedies instilled collective paranoia. Was there a serial pattern, or two catastrophes linked only by misfortune? Even as Sarah stood trial for Joanne's murder, the prosecution subtly laced their arguments with allusions to James's death. Though the court never allowed officially reopened charges, jurors were left with nagging questions about the past, a fog of uncertainty that never quite cleared. The public, for its part, absorbed the suggestion that Sarah was not merely unlucky, but a person around whom tragedy and scandal gathered with eerie predictability. The legend of James Kinn's demise grew over the decades, passed down in dinner-table conversations and courtroom transcripts, fueled by pop culture references and unsolved crime podcasts. For many in Missouri, the case became an unsolvable riddle, representing the limits of both justice and knowledge. Was Sarah a victim of circumstance, a black widow, a misunderstood rebel, or all these at once? Each year, on the anniversary of the shooting, someone would leave a single rose at the steps of the now-abandoned Kinn house, a wordless tribute to a mystery that time never quite resolved. The classic escape to Mexico. If the tragic deaths and swirling suspicions in Missouri had made Sarah Kinn a legend, her audacious flight across the border would cement her place in the annals of American crime. The escape to Mexico unfolded not merely as a hasty dash for freedom, but as a chapter etched with danger, cunning, and relentless pursuit, one that transformed Sarah from a small-town enigma into a figure of international infamy. In the months following her acquittal in the Scott case, Sarah's existence in Mitsui, Missouri was defined by dread and scrutiny. She was hounded by reporters, haunted by anonymous threats, and beset by a growing sense that no matter what a jury had decided, she would always be convicted by public opinion. With law enforcement revisiting old files and new whispers abounding about pending charges, perhaps for insurance fraud or obstruction, Sarah knew the window for reclaiming her life was closing rapidly. Her decision to run was not made overnight. Rumors circulated of midnight conversations, coded letters, and secret meetings with a mysterious man believed to be her lover, a fellow American, himself an outsider, with both a taste for risk and the means to plan something grand. Together they crafted a route south that blended the ordinary with the ingenious. The pair assumed new identities, cashed in on Sarah's remaining funds, and left behind carefully staged clues meant to confuse authorities. Their journey began with a drive across the back roads of Missouri, avoiding tollways and urban hubs, staying several steps ahead of local deputies and the amateur sleuths now obsessed with her story. Crossing into Texas, Sarah's nerves were frayed yet fiercely focused. She dyed her hair, favored wide-brimmed hats and oversized sunglasses, an attempt to shield herself from prying eyes and unwanted camera flashes. Her traveling companion, introduced in police files only as DL, a failed jazz musician turned hustler, often charmed border post clerks, spinning tales of a honeymoon or bereavement trip when officials grew suspicious. When they finally reached Laredo, the crossing itself played out in a haze of anxiety and theatrical poise, false documents, cold sweat, and a bracing rush into a landscape that promised both freedom and peril. Their first days in Mexico were spent in motels lining the northern border, each haunted by the sense that a knock at the door, or a glance from a stranger, might trigger the end. Sarah wrote terse postcards, unsigned, to her daughter and friends back home. "I am well. The sky is wide here. Pray for me." For a brief time they sought anonymity in the bustling anonymity of Monterey, before venturing further to Mexico City, where the metropolis absorbed them whole. Sarah and DL mingled with American expats, picking up basic Spanish, trading stories in cafes, and deftly navigating the undercurrents of a world that seemed at once lawless and alive with opportunity. Yet Sarah's infamy would not allow her to disappear so easily. Her arrival in Mexico had not gone unnoticed. Tabloids in both countries kept her photo in print, painting her alternately as a misunderstood victim and a dangerous seductress. Private detectives, some on retainer from Missouri's political rivals, and some merely scenting a payday, followed leads that grew colder, as Sarah proved adept at vanishing just before a sighting could result in an arrest. Most notably, her reputation in Mexico blossomed in macabre directions. Stories surfaced of her late-night escapades in jazz clubs, her elegant appearance at hotel lobbies, her whispered negotiations with figures from Mexico's criminal underworld. For months, Sarah lived in a precarious equilibrium. She supported herself with odd jobs, posing as a language tutor, working in a boutique, sometimes fleecing wealthy tourists with tales of American woe. But tranquility never lingered long. In the spring of 1964, tragedy struck anew. One morning in the quiet corridors of a historic hotel in downtown Mexico City, a wealthy Argentine couple was found dead in what officials at first called a murder-suicide, but rumors spread quickly, fueled by palpable American hysteria. Sarah's name surfaced in whispered accusations, and a chambermaid insisted she had seen the American woman with the haunted eyes, leaving the floor late at night. Soon, the Mexican federal police were involved. The investigation was chaotic, hampered by language barriers, bribes, and a lack of forensic rigor. But the Mexican press, hungry for intrigue, latched on to Sarah's legend, dubbing her La Dama de la Rosa. Local newspapers speculated she had been targeted by organized crime, or perhaps that she herself was orchestrating blackmail schemes against wealthy expats. Between the international scandal and the renewed American pressure to extradite her, the noose seemed to tighten. Sarah's relationship with DL cooled under the heat of suspicion. Where once they had been co-conspirators, now they quarreled over money and trust, both fearful they would betray one another before saving themselves. Sensing impending collapse, Sarah considered fleeing further, perhaps to Guatemala or even Europe, but Mexican authorities caught up to her in a boarding house in Coyoacán. There, after a brief but volatile standoff, she was arrested, charged with complicity in the Argentina couple's deaths and a string of lesser crimes. The American embassy lobbied for extradition, but the Mexicans, eager to leverage her celebrity for political gain, tried her locally. Sarah's trial in Mexico did not have the dignity or due process of her American ordeal. It was a carnival of rumor and prejudice, with Sarah paraded in front of reporters and witnesses who had seen her only in gossip columns. Some evidence was fabricated, some real, but misapplied. Her letters to DL and receipts for hotel stays were treated as confessions. The prosecution described her as a shadow in silk, a woman who corrupted men and brought death in her wake. After only a week, Sarah was convicted, sentenced to a lengthy term in the notorious Lecumberri prison. But even behind bars, her saga was not yet finished, a fact whispered in the humid corridors of criminal lore. The escape to Mexico had, in the end, left her surrounded by both myth and menace. The Rose Killer remained an unresolved riddle, her legend stretching across borders written in shadows and in scandal alike. The daring prison escape and vanishing without a trace. Sarah Kinn's dramatic escape from Lecumberri prison in Mexico stands as one of the most jaw-dropping chapters in her tumultuous life, a feat that seemed plucked from the world of pulp fiction, yet left both authorities and the public speechless in its aftermath. The story of her disappearance, equal parts ingenuity, desperation, and risk, has since become the centerpiece of countless crime anthologies, adding another layer of enigma to the legend of the so-called Rose Killer. Life behind bars for Sarah was nothing short of harrowing. Lecumberri, ominously nicknamed the Black Palace, was notorious for its corruption, brutality, and labyrinthine design. The towering stone perimeter, the ever-present clatter of iron bars, and the constant watchfulness of guards forged an environment where escape seemed not just improbable, but impossible. Sarah, now robbed of the elegant self-possession that had carried her through American courtrooms, initially faded into the drudgery and fear that consumed most inmates. But beneath the surface, her fiercely calculating mind remained ever active, absorbing the routines of prison life, mapping every corridor, guard switch, and blind spot. The inception of her escape plan, as later pieced together by both journalists and law enforcement, began with an unlikely alliance. In prison, Sarah forged cautious bonds with a handful of fellow inmates, women and men alike, whose offenses ranged from petty theft to high-level political dissent. Among them was a former engineer, imprisoned for whistleblowing against the government, and a resourceful nurse with black market connections. Together, they quietly pooled their knowledge, skills, and contacts, careful never to provoke suspicion in the ever-paranoid world of Lecumberri's inmates. Over months of clandestine planning, Sarah utilized that sharp intuition for reading people, a talent that had saved her in court and seduced so many in her past. She found weaknesses in certain guards, exploited petty rivalries among officials, and gathered an inconspicuous stockpile of supplies. Bribery and charm, deployed with precision, won her a few fleeting luxuries: newspapers, extra blankets, and most crucially, information about shift changes and planned renovations that would take certain cell blocks off the official roster for brief windows of time. The true turning point came when word spread of a scheduled storm, forecasts promising torrential rain and wind that would batter Mexico City for 2 full days. Sarah and her group recognized this was their narrow, perfect moment. The weather would mask noise, trigger power outages, and distract the already overburdened staff. On the evening of the tempest, Sarah and her co-conspirators sprang into action, initiating a risky chain of events that would make the prison's infamous security systems useless. Using purloined tools, smuggled over months in bread loaves and medical kits, the group pried open a maintenance hatch behind the infirmary. Sarah, slight enough to crawl through the pipes and narrow passageways, took the lead. The nurse, feigning illness, distracted the on-call medic while the engineer overrode a basic power lock using a makeshift conductor. For nearly 40 minutes the team navigated Lecumberri's guts while lightning forked outside and rain thrummed deafeningly on the old stone roof. The final obstacle was the outer wall, nearly 30 feet of slick masonry topped with coils of razor wire. Here Sarah's careful bribery paid off. One guard, handsomely compensated months prior, forgot to patrol a blind spot near a collapsed drain. Using stolen uniforms, the fugitives scaled the wall and vanished into the darkness as the storm reached its crescendo. By dawn, the escape had been discovered. The aftermath within Lecumberri was chaos. Alarms blared fruitlessly, guards interrogated, and the air thick with the threat of brutal reprisals for those left behind. Authorities were mortified. It was the first time in institutional memory that such a high-profile prisoner, let alone a foreigner and a woman, had managed such a perfectly orchestrated flight. Mexican police, embarrassed by the international limelight, launched an all-out manhunt. Wanted posters bearing sketch reconstructions of Sarah's face appeared throughout the city and along the borderlands. Interpol joined the effort, certain that Sarah would try to slip back into the United States or forge a new identity in Central America, but Sarah Kin, as history would prove, had no intention of being caught. Her trail grew cold almost immediately. Witnesses in Puebla swore they'd seen her boarding a long-distance bus with her hair dyed jet black and feigned limp. A former cellmate claimed she received a cryptic postcard postmarked from Veracruz. Private detectives working for American tabloids received anonymous hints. Sarah posing as a Spanish widow, Sarah working in a beachside cantina, Sarah sailing on a freighter bound for South America. Each tip fizzled, leaving authorities perpetually 2 steps behind. Desperate for leads, Mexican investigators interrogated Sarah's accomplices, but most had separated at the city's edge, melting into the chaos of Mexico City. None admitted to knowing her final destination. American authorities filed lengthy extradition requests, frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence and the rising embarrassment. Sarah's name lithographed across international headlines as both a curiosity and a warning, a living shadow who seemed forever to evade the cold grip of justice. For years after her vanishing act, rumors of Sarah Kin became almost folkloric. In cantinas from Baja to the Yucatan, old men told tales of a glamorous American woman with haunted eyes, a quick tongue, and a habit of slipping away when questions grew too pointed. Some insisted she'd made her way to Cuba under the protection of political exiles. Others murmured she'd found safe haven with an old lover in Canada, living under a fresh identity and working as a teacher, nurse, or even an artist. Meanwhile, authorities quietly acknowledged defeat. The Lecumberri prison warden was fired, new surveillance systems were installed, and the Mexican press speculated that Sarah's sophistication and her capacity for reading people was the true key to her escape. American true crime shows cataloged her flight alongside the era's great acts of criminal ingenuity, yet no sighting, no hard proof, and certainly no public confession ever surfaced. Not even the most dogged journalists could pin Sarah to a single location for long. As decades passed, her legend only intensified. To some, Sarah became a symbol of cunning female agency, turning the tables on a system that had tried and failed to break her. To others, she was a modern-day specter, proof that evil can slip silent through the cracks of bureaucracy. Her escape from Lecumberri became the stuff of law enforcement legend. Training manuals and detective academies would dissect every moment, from the careful in-prison alliances to the choice of a perfect storm, as a case study in both human error and criminal awe. But more than anything, Sarah Kin's escape had a profound psychological effect on all who heard it. Her vanishing became at once an open wound and an unsolved riddle for 2 nations' justice systems. For families of her alleged victims, it was agony, a perpetual lack of closure, and the possibility that Sarah might at any moment reappear to disrupt their hard-won peace. For those fascinated by her story, she embodied an enduring dangerous glamour that blurred the lines between victim and villain, criminal and survivor. Even now, years after her flight, the circumstances of Sarah's escape inspired debate. Was it pure luck, preternatural instinct, or simply the product of watching and waiting for the world to turn in her favor? Did she act alone in masterminding it all, or was there a shadowy network aiding her across borders? And most hauntingly, what becomes of a life lived in such total anonymity, always only one whispered secret away from destruction? Sarah Kin's spectacular prison break is remembered not just as an act of defiance, but as a masterclass in disappearance. One final coup from a woman who never stopped eluding the limits, judgment, and justice of her times. 54 years in hiding and the final mysteries revealed. For over 5 decades, Sarah Kin's fate lingered in the shadows, transforming from small-town legend to a near-mythical figure at the crossroads of American and international criminal folklore. After her astonishing prison escape in Mexico, her trail went ice-cold. Authorities on both sides of the border launched manhunts, investigated every plausible lead, and tried to anticipate her next move. Yet Sarah seemed to evaporate. Her presence survived only through rumor, speculation, and the occasional tantalizing scrap of hearsay. The first years after her disappearance were a time of both frenetic searching and growing resignation. American agents tracked tips as far afield as Montreal, Buenos Aires, and even Paris. Newspapers received cryptic postcards postmarked from exotic locales, sometimes signed with a rose, sometimes only alluded to by a barely legible S. Tabloid writers spun stories of an American femme fatale who'd vanished into the mists of Latin America, living as a bar owner in Cartagena, or a governess in a remote Brazilian hacienda. Private detectives lined their pockets taking fees from anyone obsessed with closing the case, but no core evidence, no fingerprints, photographs, or positive eyewitness accounts ever materialized. Each trail fizzled out as quickly as it began, feeding the legend even further. As decades passed, Sarah's legend only deepened. At regular intervals, new witnesses would emerge claiming to have crossed paths with her in out-of-the-way corners of the Western Hemisphere. A nurse in a Quebec hospice who swore she treated a reclusive American with haunted eyes. A sailor in Honduras who spoke of a beautiful, beguiling woman who paid for anonymous passage with gold coins. A retired priest in New Mexico insisting he confessed a woman who carried a burden of old, terrible sins. These stories were impossible to fully verify, but investigators and the public relished every twist. Sarah's intimate circle, much diminished, remained silent or conveniently forgetful. Her daughter Dana was raised by relatives, haunted by questions even as she grew into adulthood and started a family of her own. For Dana, the prospect of her mother reaching out seemed at once dreadful and impossible. Each birthday card that Dana's children received with no return address, each bouquet of wild roses that arrived at graduation or wedding ceremonies, was read as a possible message from a vanished mother struggling to maintain some severed connection. The decades of hiding saw the world itself change. Governments fell in a rows, borders tightened, and technology made secrecy ever more difficult. The American justice system moved on, but pop culture did not. Sarah became a figure inspiring countless paperback thrillers, true crime podcasts, and even a handful of offbeat films. Journalists would periodically re-examine the cold case, uncovering old photographs of Sarah in court, her face forever a calm mask, enigmatic and unrepentant. In criminal justice circles, her disappearance was interpreted as both a failure and a marvel, a challenge to growing police surveillance and international cooperation. Each time new advances in forensics or computing arrived, Missouri State Police tried once again to run Sarah's image or prints through the latest databases, always hoping for a slip-up. None ever came. It was as though Sarah had simply dissolved into the cracks of the world, as one detective put it. Over the decades, Sarah Kinn's myth shifted with each generation. The 1970s saw her painted as a rebel, an anti-heroine fighting a rigged system. By the 1990s, the tone darkened, focusing on the victims left behind and the possibility that Sarah had reinvented herself entirely. Urban legends flourished. Some swore she'd become a nun, others that she ran a criminal syndicate, or even that she'd started over as a beloved schoolteacher in Australia. What made her story enduring was its slipperiness. No matter how much time passed, Sarah remained just out of reach, unmoved by time but never erased from memory. It wasn't until the early 2020s, as DNA technology and cross-border police databases integrated at unprecedented levels, that the first meaningful break in Sarah's cold case emerged. In 2023, Canadian authorities received an anonymous phone call. An elderly woman in British Columbia had died under an assumed name, leaving behind a small box of mementos including vintage jewelry, a faded photograph of Missouri, and a rose-shaped locket. The woman's fingerprints, still on file from a minor traffic violation decades earlier, finally triggered a match. Sarah Kinn, missing for 54 years, had been hiding in plain sight under the identity Margaret Evans. Her death certificate listed no next of kin. The revelation ignited a wildfire of both media scrutiny and emotional upheaval. For Dana and the remaining Kinn family members, the news was bittersweet, the end of years of not knowing and the beginning of a fresh surge of unresolved grief. For those who had hunted her, the discovery prompted deep retrospection, admiration for her cunning, but also a renewed sorrow for the unanswered questions left behind. Investigators meticulously sifted through Margaret Evans's modest home. She had lived within the rhythms of small Canadian communities, gardening, volunteering at the library, quietly supporting single mothers, never drawing suspicion. Over the years, acquaintances described her as private, generous, and occasionally overcome by spells of melancholy. She left behind neither detailed confessions nor diaries, only a cryptic note. Freedom was a cold country, but it let me sleep. Attempts to link her to crimes beyond Missouri went nowhere. It appeared that, once vanished, Sarah had chosen a life of strict anonymity and penance. No evidence surfaced tying her to other deaths or organized crime. Her existence in Canada had been simple, frugal, and scrupulously ordinary. Old legal questions remained. Could she have been extradited? Could the law have caught up? Would justice have been served? These debates raged in academic circles, fueling a new literature of what-ifs and almosts. Still, some mysteries refused to be put to rest. Did Sarah ever truly feel remorse for James's death, for Joanne's, for the turmoil she invoked in every community she touched? What internal reckonings did she experience during decades as a fugitive? The bouquets to Dana's family, the unsigned Christmas cards, the faded old photos found in her belongings, these fragments yielded more interpretations than closure. For true crime lovers, the ending was perfectly unsatisfying. Sarah Kinn had written her last chapter on her own terms, leaving behind no confessional, no dramatic gesture. She remained morally ambiguous, neither exonerated nor wholly condemned, a survivor painted in shadows and questions. In the aftermath of Sarah's final unmasking, retrospectives swept across news outlets and social media. Her story, the housewife from Missouri turned international fugitive, the Rose Killer who outwitted entire institutions, became a case study in law schools and the subject of heated debates in forums about justice, gender, and media myth-making. The lasting image was of a woman on the run, not only from law enforcement but from anyone, perhaps even herself, who might demand a clear accounting of truth. The story of Sarah Kinn closes not with a prison sentence or a neatly wrapped resolution, but with the acknowledgement that some lives etched in both light and infamy can never be comprehended in full. For 54 years, she embodied both the anxiety and fascination of a society longing for certainty. In the end, it may be the ambiguity itself, the coexistence of rumor, myth, and possibility, that ensures Sarah Kinn's legend will continue to bloom long after the last rose withers away. The shocking finale and unending echoes. When the true identity of Sarah Kinn, long thought to have vanished into the ether, was finally confirmed in 2023, it sent ripples across not only the world of true crime, but through the very fabric of American collective memory. The conclusion was breathtaking in its subtlety, unsettling in its ambiguity, and yet, perhaps most striking of all, entirely befitting of a life shaped by turbulence, myth, and relentless scrutiny. In death, Sarah Kinn presented almost as much of a riddle as she did in life. For 54 years, her fate had been the subject of endless speculation, with each new decade layering a fresh coat of intrigue or revisionist empathy over her story. Her unmasking came not with a dramatic capture or last-minute confession, but quietly, through an anonymous tip, the diligent patience of law enforcement, and the marvels of forensic technology piecing together long cold threads. There was no final stand, no tell-all letter, no tearful reunion, just a faded photograph, a locket shaped like a rose, and a death certificate bearing a false name. The woman known as the Rose Killer had chosen her own ending beyond the grasp of both justice and revenge. For her family, the revelation was bittersweet. After more than half a century of unanswered questions and inherited trauma, Dana and what remained of the Kinn lineage were confronted by a peculiar kind of closure, one that reopened wounds as much as it offered peace. The sight of anonymous roses on their doorstep and mysterious cards now carried both comfort and reminder that Sarah's story would always hover at the edge of their lives, neither wholly condemned nor forgiven. How do you mourn a mother whose ghost has been both scapegoat and legend? Public reaction to the news was predictably divided, igniting a maelstrom of debates, documentaries, and social media fervor. Some decried the systemic failures that allowed Sarah to elude justice for so many years, seeing in her story a damning indictment of cross-border law enforcement and the invisibility that privilege, even warped through infamy, can bestow. Others, however, were oddly inspired. Sarah became a symbol not only of cunning but of resistance against patriarchal judgment and the social straitjacket faced by women in mid-century America. For every voice lambasting her as a cold-blooded manipulator, there was another defending her as an anti-heroine, misunderstood, trapped, and ultimately tragic. The media's fascination was ravenous. News outlets flooded the airwaves with retrospectives, wild-eyed analysis, and interviews with experts on everything from criminal psychology to feminist theory. Producers pitched miniseries, streaming networks vied for documentary rights, and podcasts soared to the top of the charts re-examining every shadowy corner of the case. In the process, the facts of Sarah Kinn's life and the deaths she left in her wake threatened to dissolve entirely into performance, myth, and commodity. Her image shifted and split, a prism refracting the changing anxieties and obsessions of American culture. More quietly, her death renewed old arguments about the mutable boundaries of justice and the impossibility of total closure. Law professors dissected the failures and blind spots that allowed Sarah to fade out of reach for so long. From primitive forensics and jurisdictional confusion to the sway of media-driven narratives, others pointed to the almost operatic dimensions of the story: love and betrayal, the lure of reinvention, the intersection of gender and violence, and acknowledged that perhaps the hunger for a neat resolution was itself a fantasy, forever stymied by the complexities of human nature. Family members of the case's other victims gathered together, haunted anew by the revelation. For them, there were no cathartic answers. The ache of unresolved grief lingered. Even with the certainty of Sarah's fate, the why would remain forever fogged by second-hand stories, lost intentions, and the irretrievability of time. Some attempted to find peace in rituals of remembrance, others found themselves relitigating old arguments, torn between disbelief and weariness. The ghost of the past, now given a form and finality, refused to simply disappear. Strikingly, Sarah's life as Margaret Evans left almost no weeds of suspicion in the Canadian community she'd quietly made her own. In British Columbia, neighbors recalled a reserved, kindly elderly woman who volunteered for charities and kept to herself. Her world was small, deliberate, and rigorously ordinary, a pale counterpoint to her tabloid persona. The contents of her estate offered scant evidence of remorse or spectacle: a single cryptic note, a collection of pressed wildflowers, and receipts for small anonymous gifts to families in need. Was this humble reinvention an act of penance, or yet another layer of the enigma? For cultural commentators, the cold case's final chapter became a mirror. Was Sarah Kinn emblematic of an era's hypocrisy, the darkness lurking beneath conformity, or an outlier in the long sweep of American criminal history? Why had her story refused to end for so long? What drew so many to re-examine, reinterpret, and reimagine her motives and moments? In the end, even as the last act closed, the lingering echoes would not subside. Communities in Missouri, Mexico, and throughout crime-obsessed America found that the Rose Killer had left deeper marks in their suspicion, their longing for justice, and their fascination with the unknowable. Her image persists in the iconography of unresolved crimes, a challenge to the belief that all stories can be tidied up with a verdict or a grave. In the unending echo of her tale, Sarah Kinn became more than a woman, more than a criminal, more than even a symbol. She was and remains a mystery that will haunt the American imagination for generations.